All right. And it is 2 o'clock. We have a certain number of people. So I am delighted to welcome you to the National Association of Scholars webinar on Unidentified Aerial Phenomena, Policy and Strategy for the Unknown. Now, this is technically a one-off webinar. It's not part of our regular series, but we may actually be following this up with stuff on related topics. For example, the effects of artificial intelligence, other things in effect which are translating from the speculative to the real world. So this may be the first of a series. Stay tuned. Now, I'm David Randall, Director of Research for the National Association of Scholars, and I am delighted to welcome to me, we have 2 of our 3 panelists, and we hope our third one will be showing up soon, but we have Ian Oxnevad, Program Research Associate at the National Association of Scholars and author of The Truth is Mostly Right Here, The Security Dilemma and the Earthly Logic of an Extraterrestrial Threat. We also have with us Nick Pope, former acting deputy director in the Directorate of Defence Security and former operational head of the UK Ministry of Defence UFO program. And we are hoping soon to have Avi Loeb, the Frank B. Baird Junior Professor of Science at Harvard University. He's showed up. Lovely. Professor Loeb, we're so glad to have you here. I've just been doing the introductions. Now, the order, I think, is going to be Nick Pope first, then Professor Loeb, then Ian Oxnevad, each for, say 14, 15 minutes. There will then be some time for Q&A afterwards, moderated by yours truly. Any questions will come via the chat or the Q&A button. I will pass them on, and any questions that don't get answered, send them to me afterwards, randall@nas.org, so I can pass them on to the participants. And this is being recorded for posterity. So don't worry about not having a chance. If you have to get off early, you'll be able to see this again later on our YouTube channel. Having said that, may I please ask, Nick, would you be so kind as to give us your first talk?
Thank you very much, David, and thank you to the National Association of Scholars for hosting this event on this subject, whose time has most definitely come. So essentially, as you said in the introduction, I was a civilian employee of the UK Ministry of Defence for 21 years, and the UK MOD is the equivalent of the US Department of Defense. We get moved around every few years, and from 91 to 94, I was responsible for investigating the UFO issue. And not because the Ministry of Defense had a corporate belief in extraterrestrials, though we didn't rule it out, but we viewed it simply as a case of if there was something flying in our airspace, self-evidently we needed to know what it was. The government, the military, needed to identify it. And we received about 200 or 300 reports each year. We investigated these. Most of them, of course, turned out to be misidentifications of fairly ordinary objects and phenomena. But what we were more interested in were the cases where these things were seen by military pilots, where they were tracked on civil or military radar systems, often performing speeds, maneuvers, and accelerations that seemed to exceed anything in our own inventory, and anything that we assessed foreign adversaries as having to through intelligence means. Or also of interest to us were cases where we had photographs and videos that intelligence community imagery analysts could have a look at and start to make some calculations about. So that was the theory of what we did. The practice, of course, was absolutely fascinating. Some amazing cases in our archives. And a lot of this has now, one of the reasons why I can talk about this is the British government has declassified and released around 60,000 pages of documents, some of it quite highly classified or formally so, of course. So 60,000 pages of documents about all this in the public domain, some intriguing cases. I mean, by one of these marvelous coincidences. Today is actually the 29th anniversary of one of the most amazing cases on my watch for this subject. We had multiple sightings around a lot of the United Kingdom, large triangular shaped craft capable of moving from a virtual hover to very high Mach speeds in a very short order of time. I mean, literally just seconds. I had Air Force witnesses say to me, Nick, I've been in the Royal Air Force 8 years, never seen anything like this before in my life. Some of the witnesses saw a narrow beam of light come down from this UFO, track from side to side. Some of the people heard a low frequency humming sound coming from it. And as I say, lots of police witnesses, lots of military witnesses, big investigation, no definitive conclusion. I mean, clearly with something like this, you face the question, is this some sort of secret prototype aircraft or drone, either our own, an ally, or an adversary, that even those of us in MOD headquarters could not get access to in that highly classified, deeply compartmentalized world? And of course, we never ruled out that possibility. So the Ministry of Defense split into factions on this issue. There was a faction that certainly thought it was all nonsense, misidentifications, hoaxes, and psychological delusions. There was a faction that thought secret prototype aircraft, missiles, and drones was the way to go. There was a faction that started exploring the possibility of exotic atmospheric plasma phenomena. And then there was a faction that dared to think the unthinkable and say, well, what if this really were extraterrestrial? And I certainly flirted with that faction for a while. And I think the way that we characterize this is the way that government often characterizes something that you might think on the face of it is quite unlikely. But we use the phrase low probability, high impact, which is used in government. It's used in intelligence circles. It's also used in the business community. And it's something which, even if you think has a very small proportion of happening, the implications, the impact, the consequences, if any of it's true, are such that you should be in the game and you should be looking. And that was our view. Why wouldn't we at least want to look? Why wouldn't we at least want to think about this? Because the military, the scientific, the socioeconomic consequences of this, if just a single one of these cases really were something extraordinary and perhaps even extraterrestrial, the consequences justified the comparatively small resources involved in looking at this. And when I say small resources, most of the things you need to investigate UFOs from within government already exist, of course. They're already set up for other defense and national security purposes. Your military radar systems, your military satellites, your people skilled in the various disciplines like MASINT, measurement and signature intelligence, where you can look at photos and videos and you can say, am I looking at the engine of a MiG-29 or is it something else? And if something else, what? You can do all sorts of technical analysis on that. But my apologies, I'm not a scientist. So we had our scientific and technical people do that for us policy wonks. So that was one aspect of the phenomenon. And then fast forward a number of years, and we come to the situation that we see now, with this subject rightly transitioning out of the fringe and into the mainstream. I think gone are the days where people associate this with science fiction or conspiracy theories. And there is a growing realization that, hey, this is one of these areas where part of the conspiracy theory turned out to be true. Because people in the UFO community for many years said, I don't believe the government. The US government said, we used to have a program called Project Blue Book. We looked at this, we didn't find anything. We closed it in 1969, and nobody's been doing anything since. The UFO community didn't believe that. Turns out they were right. In December 2017, the New York Times broke a story, put it on the front page, about the existence of a program called ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. And this was disguised as a program to look at next generation aerospace and weapon threats to the US. But in reality, one of the things it was doing was looking at UFOs. And in association with that, or rather after the New York Times broke that story, closely followed by the Post, Politico, all the major TV networks and the world's media. Shortly after that, of course, Congress got involved, and they said the same as the media and the public. Hey, you told us you weren't doing this. There was no program. What's this we read in the Times? Let us know what's going on. And classified briefings followed. And then they set up an organization called the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, embedded in the DoD to look at this. You've probably seen, a lot of people have seen those 3 videos of US Navy jets apparently chasing UFOs. The videos aren't just in the media, they are on the DoD website in association with a press release saying, yes, these are genuine Navy videos, and the phenomena shown remain characterized as unidentified. So this isn't just some video parked on YouTube somewhere. This is official. And so we got the various congressional committees in both the House and the Senate taking a look, predominantly intelligence committees and armed services committees, appropriation committees too. And then last summer, many of you will have seen this fact that the Office of the Director of National Intelligence produced a preliminary intelligence assessment of the phenomena. It ran to 9 pages. In the last week or so, a Freedom of Information Act researcher called John Greenwald put a classified version, or a partially redacted still, of course, but classified version of this report on his Black Vault website. And again, proof that the government, the military, the intelligence community are now taking this phenomena seriously. And one reason, by the way, people for wondering why we dropped the term UFO and replaced it with UAP, it was essentially a rebranding exercise. We in the Ministry of Defense didn't invent the term UAP, but in the early 90s, when we wanted people to take it more seriously, we substituted in UAP, and the US government subsequently adopted that. And I'll conclude my introductory remarks by just bringing us up to date and saying that in the newly signed defense bill, there are multiple UAP provisions. And so Congress is continuing to pressure the DoD, the military, and the intelligence community to take this seriously, to answer all of this. They want it treated as a defense and national security issue, rightly so. And also, long overdue, they want a science plan as part of this. So with that, I will conclude and say thank you for listening, and I look forward to questions after the other panelists have had their say. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'll now ask Dr. Loeb, would you be so kind as to give us your talk?
Sure. So in fact, let me share some slides. I'm actually giving a lecture on Monday at 7 p.m. at Harvard, and you could find it on Twitter or online if you want to hear more details. So I'm sharing my screen, and I'll start from the middle. I'll just describe in 10-15 minutes one of the topics, which is the closest to me, complementary to what Nick was discussing, which has to do with data that came from the scientific community. So here we're talking about data collected by astronomers. So the scientific method is quite different than the government approach to collecting data. We're not dealing with instruments on a jittery cockpit of a fighter jet. We are dealing with instruments that are under full control. We know exactly what they're doing. We are looking at the sky with telescopes and we measure things, scientifically speaking, and we publish them in scientific peer-reviewed journals. So everything that I will tell you is based on data. Now, of course, what the data means is a subject for debate, but I'm a scientist, so I'll speak from that point of view. And it all started on October 19th, 2017, when an object from outside the solar system was discovered, the first one that was ever found near Earth from outside the solar system. How do we know that? Because it moved too fast to be bound gravitationally to the sun. If an object moves too fast, it cannot be gravitationally bound. That's how we send spacecraft, simply because they move faster than 11 kilometers per second relative to Earth. So they're not bound to Earth. If you throw a tennis ball up, it comes down. But if you throw it fast enough, it will escape the pull of the Earth. This object was moving too fast to be bound to the sun. It cannot be like a planet moving around many times. It couldn't have been launched from Earth. Okay, so that's the first object we found. And it was the size of a football field, and we detected by the reflection of sunlight from it. The telescope that discovered it is Pan-STARRS. It's the first telescope that allows us to see an object the size of a football field from the reflection of sunlight within the orbit of the Earth around the sun. You may ask, why did we find it only in 2017? Because before that, we didn't have a survey telescope that was able to see an object as big as a football field. And by the way, NASA never launched a spacecraft that is as big as a football field. It only launched smaller things. So when Enrico Fermi asked, where is everybody? It's just like staying at home and saying, I don't hear a knock on my door, therefore I have no neighbors. We need to search, and we need to be sensitive enough. You can't find fish without a fishing net. And this is the first object found. Now, of course, the astronomers immediately assumed that it must be a rock, must be an asteroid or a comet. Actually, they said it's a comet. A comet is a rock covered with ice. So when it gets close to the sun, the ice evaporates, you get the water vapor and dust surrounding it as a cometary tail. There was no such tail around this object. It also came from a special frame of reference, which is called the local standard of rest, which is the frame that you get to when you average over the motions of all the stars in the vicinity of the sun. Sort of like the local galactic parking lot. And only 1 in 500 stars is at rest, as much as this object was. It was given the name Oumuamua, which means a scout in the Hawaiian language, because the telescope that discovered it was in Hawaii. So Oumuamua was unusual because it came from this special frame of reference, like a buoy on the surface of the ocean, and the sun, like a giant ship, bumped into it and gave it a kick through its gravitational force. Now, the object was tumbling every 8 hours, and the amount of sunlight reflected from it changed by a factor of 10. That meant that it has a very extreme shape. Think about a piece of paper tumbling in the wind. The amount of area projected on the sky had to change by a factor of 10 as the object was spinning. And the best fit to the variation of light, this is from a scientific paper, was that of a pancake-shaped object, disc-shaped, flat, which is quite unusual. Not only it was not a comet, it was most likely flat at the 90% confidence. And the Spitzer Space Telescope tried to look for any gas around it, any traces of carbon-based molecules. You can see the image on the top right, didn't see anything. Nevertheless, the object was pushed away from the sun by a force that appears mysterious, because it couldn't be the rocket effect from the evaporation of the object. It wasn't evaporating. The question is, what was pushing it? And the only explanation I could think of was the reflection of sunlight. And for that to be effective, the object had to be very thin, sort of like a sail. But nature doesn't make thin objects. So we suggested in a scientific paper back in 2018, and later I wrote many other papers, that it may be artificial in origin from another civilization. There were many anomalies to Oumuamua. I will not get into all of them. They're all described in my book, Extraterrestrial, which was published a year ago and became bestseller in many countries, translated to 25 languages. So if you're interested, check it out. It just came in paperback, came out a month ago. I will just say that, of course, there was a lot of pushback from the mainstream of astronomy. The astronomers didn't want to discuss an artificial origin. They argued it's an extraordinary claim. I don't see why it's an extraordinary claim. We exist. We sent out equipment to space. We know that half of the sun-like stars have a planet the size of the Earth at the same separation. So what we find near us is common. And most stars formed billions of years before the sun. They had plenty of time to send equipment to space. So why should we exclude that possibility? But those astronomers proposed alternative explanations. For example, maybe it's a cloud of dust particles. We've never seen anything like it. The suggestion was a cloud of dust particles 100 times less dense than air, so that it's very fluffy and therefore gets pushed by reflecting sunlight. And the problem with that is that such a cloud would not maintain its integrity when it gets close to the sun. It would be heated by hundreds of degrees, doesn't have the material strength. Another suggestion was maybe it's a chunk of frozen hydrogen. Again, we've never seen anything like it before. We don't know if nature makes chunks of frozen nitrogen the size of a football field. Nevertheless, the mainstream astronomers said, yes, that's it. It's frozen hydrogen because when hydrogen evaporates, it's transparent. We wouldn't see it as a cometary tail, and then the push comes from the standard cometary evaporation, the rocket effect. The problem with this proposal is that the hydrogen evaporates very quickly. So such a chunk of frozen hydrogen wouldn't survive the journey through interstellar space, given the starlight that it absorbs. So then there was the final suggestion that everyone cheered for. Oh, so maybe it's a nitrogen iceberg chipped off a planet like Pluto around another star. And everyone said, yes, that's it. The only problem there is that there is not enough solid nitrogen. If you sum up over all the planets like Pluto, you won't get enough chips produced. Even if you chip it off, everything, there is just not enough solid nitrogen to account for a large enough population of chips such that we would see one of them. The fundamental question is whether Oumuamua was natural or artificial in origin. And the way I think of this is walking on the beach and seeing rocks and seashells that are naturally produced. These are like the asteroids or comets, but every now and then you stumble over a plastic bottle, which may be Oumuamua, indicating a civilization out there. I should say that in September 2020, there was another object that exhibited the same qualities as Oumuamua. It was pushed away from the sun by reflecting sunlight and didn't show any cometary evaporation. It was given the name 2020 SO, discovered by the same telescope in Hawaii. And then it was realized a few weeks later that if you extrapolate the trajectory back in time, this object was actually a rocket booster that NASA launched in 1966 as part of a lunar lander mission. So we know that it had thin walls, and that's why it had a large area for its mass, and it can be pushed by reflection of sunlight. We also know that it's artificial because we produced it. The question is, who produced Oumuamua? And the way I think of this is just like a caveman finding a cell phone. The caveman is used to playing with rocks all of his life. And when seeing the cell phone, he would argue it's a rock of a type that we've never seen before. Just like my colleagues were arguing about Oumuamua. It's a hydrogen iceberg and nitrogen iceberg, a rock of a type that we've never seen before. We don't know if it exists, but it must be natural. And of course, one can write an equation that describes the chance of finding equipment from another civilization. It's different from the Drake equation that people are talking about in the context of radio signals, because here you just depend on the number of plastic bottles per unit volume in space. And then you multiply that by the survey volume to find how many you will find. Or if you use the Earth as your fishing net, then you also need the speed of these objects, because that fixes the number of objects per unit time that are impacting the Earth and appearing as interstellar meteors. We actually, with my student, found an interstellar meteor in that was recorded in 2014. And I should say that these equations should be multiplied also by what I call the Ostrich Factor, which is the likelihood that we will behave like an ostrich and not look. So if the likelihood is 100%, if the scientists ridicule the subject and are not looking up, then we will not find anything. So the likelihood of discovery depends also on us, not just on them. And I've been struggling with this factor for a while with my colleagues that are not willing to entertain this possibility and look up. And this is why I established a new project half a year ago called the Galileo Project, and Nick Pope is a member of that. Let me skip over this. I mean, since time is short, skip over this slide. And the Galileo Project has two branches to it. One is to take a close-up photograph of the next Oumuamua. So when we identify another object that looks as weird as Oumuamua was, on its approach to us, we could send a spacecraft that will rendezvous with it, come close to it within 1,000 kilometers, and take a photograph, close-up photo. And you can see on the right side the photograph taken by the OSIRIS-REx mission to the asteroid Bennu. It landed on it, and it will bring a sample back to Earth from it next year. And clearly that was a rock. But imagine landing on an artificial object. You could see the screws and bolts on it. You may read the label, made on exoplanet Y. Then it will become obvious that it's a piece of technology. So this is not a philosophical question. A picture is worth 1,000 words. In my case, a picture is worth 66,000 words, the number of words in my book, Extraterrestrial. And I should say we have a second branch to the Galileo Project. I don't have a lot of time to get into it, but it's basically identifying those unidentified objects that Nick was talking about. And we are assembling the first telescope system to do that on the roof of the Harvard College Observatory in the coming months. And then we'll make copies of it. And the number of copies will depend on how much funding we have. Currently, we have $2 million. We'll make about 5 copies. But we really aim at 10 times more funding. And the hope is that we will remove the term UAP or UFO from our lexicon, because we will identify the nature of these objects. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go, wonderful hearing from you, and I'm going to go now to Dr. Oxnevad.
So since we're all sort of venting about our various backgrounds, areas of expertise and professions and the sort of closed thinking, basically my take on this began with looking at how international relations theory addresses or has addressed this issue after it started to come out that pilots had encountered these objects, if you will. I started to look, and suffice it to say, IR hasn't touched this at all, really, without a 10-foot pole. There hasn't been a serious sort of evidentiary-based discussion in this. And one of the problems with political science in general is that the way that the discipline works is that it tends to try to expand existing theories as opposed to looking at new events or phenomena when they occur and actually seeing if the theories fit them. So when I looked and found out that international relations theory doesn't really address this, and I started to look for where it would fit, I started to see that the possibility, not the actual existence of a UAP or an extraterrestrial civilization, but just the fact that we contemplate it, actually has really massive impacts for IR theory, the security dilemma, meaning how states sort of arm and deal with each other diplomatically in the international system, as well as how that gears us up for the possibility that we actually may come across something like that, an extraterrestrial civilization. And in a sense, that sets the grounds for a massive intelligence problem, or a massive intelligence failure, where you have a high impact event with massive implications, but low probability of it occurring, and certainly low occurrence rate of it occurring. Now, when you look at it, if you look historically, we always kind of think that this sort of ufology, or the idea of an extraterrestrial civilization, is sort of a mass cultural phenomenon. What I found is if you look at great powers, especially from the beginning of the 20th century forward, great powers have been trying to get to space. And it's usually in the context of war that they have done that. And as I started to dig through the historical sort of trajectories of these great powers that have been trying to get into space, if you look at Russia, the US, of course, Nazi Germany, and China contemporarily, if you look at it, they all conceived of an extraterrestrial civilization before they started to really push out into space, and did so in a way that weaponizes it. So I went as far back as I could in the historical record where the technology made sense. And what I found is basically at the turn of the 20th century, just as aviation was taking off, you had great powers at the time, Germany and Russia particularly, looking at the possibility of interstellar human travel. And disconcertingly, this began largely with Nazi Germany. You had Werner von Braun, who we kind of, at least in the US case, we dressed him up in red, white, and blue in the 60s and turned him into, sort of the kingmaker of American astronauts. He was not only a Nazi, but he was a super Nazi. And he was very devoted not only to building Nazi rockets, but also getting into space. In Russia, as early as 1903, you had scientists looking at the possibility of looking at how you could create a suit so that you could exist in space or function in space as a human being. And while the Tsar didn't take it very seriously, the Soviet Union did. And what I started to see was a disconcerting pattern where not only you have human beings trying to get into space, usually under the auspices of militarization or war and great power competition, but you also start to see a pattern of very totalitarian powers reaching into space. So if you look at China, for example, China does take the possibility of an extraterrestrial threat very seriously. There's an author who wrote a very famous book called The Three-Body Problem, which deals with the possibility of an extraterrestrial threat. And that author advises China's space program and its search for extraterrestrial life. And what's interesting is that the Obama administration, Obama read this book, and this was before the advent of Space Force, but it's evident that that sort of has guided the thinking as well in the US case. And basically that sort of leads us to the conclusion that, well, you do have one civilization that's pushing out into space. So we have a known universe of one case. And with that one case being human beings, we are militarizing it. So that raises the possibility of, well, this is an intelligence challenge of massive proportions. So if you look at the report that the ODNI put out that was, redacted, you had this mysterious other category of what these objects might be. Well, the possibilities from an intelligence standpoint are really, you have the US could be testing an advanced weapon system on itself. it could be Russia or China or another great power, and that would certainly fit with the historical record of great powers reaching into space or just with advanced technologies to begin with. Or C, that it is a extraterrestrial power actually looking at us, and for whatever known unknown intent and for whatever purpose, we just don't know. But those are not also mutually exclusive. Those could also be taking place simultaneously. But because human beings and great powers in particular have actually conceived of the possibility of an extraterrestrial threat, what that does is that allows great powers to ostensibly take the lid off of militarization of space and weapons development, because the very fact that we have projected that threat out there means that now we have to prepare for an unknown, and which means that our weapons abilities and our weapons development is only limited by our own imagination, because we don't know A, that this civilization exists, at least not publicly. B, we don't know what its intentions are, and we don't know what its capabilities are. So if you add that up, we're only limited by our own imagination, while we are also competing with other great powers in the international system to gobble up as much territory in space. So it's kind of telling when you had Space Force come out and say that its area of operation begins at the thermosphere at 100 kilometers and then stretches to infinity, in quotes. By doing that, if there is another civilization out there, it already exists in our stated area of operations for a military domain. And as these other countries, Russia, China, and the US, and others as well, push into space, that raises the possibility that we are going to come across them. And there's a very high possibility that as we push out over time, whatever is out there, if it comes across human beings, it's going to be through under the auspices of a military presence on the human side. So when you add that up, that sort of leads us to an intelligence problem called mirroring. We don't really know what's out there or what's not out there. It's only limited by our own imagination. So we are basically setting ourselves up for an intelligence failure by projecting that either A, for sure, that this thing, if it is out there, is actually a hostile presence, or B, that it's friendly. But either way, as we're competing in this space domain, this emerging domain with other great powers, it is taking place under the guise of the security competition, which itself lends itself to militarization. So when you sum it up, basically, when you go back to these objects, right, you have the possibility that it's the US, or at least in the US case, the US testing a weapon system on itself or a technological system on itself. That's another sort of entity altogether. That's another great power. They're not mutually exclusive. But the very fact that we have projected this possible threat into existence, and it exists in the mindset of great powers, that allows states to develop arms systems and technological systems without necessarily signaling to another great power that they're a threat, which facilitates greater armament in the first place. So the long story short is that it's kind of disconcerting when you look at how we are reaching into space, at least from an IR perspective, because we know for sure that there is one warlike species reaching out into space, and it's us. So that's the system from IR. And the problem with this is that from a disciplinary standpoint, we're still somewhat limited in terms of how farther we can push this in terms of studying this, but it does deserve to be a new sort of specialty subfield within IR, international relations. Thanks, David.
Thank you. Sorry, I was muted there. So everybody listening, please put in questions to Q&A in chat. I'm going to put in a special plug, questions early to Dr. Loeb, if you would, because he has to rush at 3 sharp. I think the rest of us can, twiddle on a bit longer. I'll just say quickly first, however, a question from Lee Santillo. A question for Nick Pope. I live very closely to Devonport Naval Dockyard in Plymouth, UK. I often see a lot of aerial phenomena in the sky, very close to the base, usually a bright orange lights in the sky. Did Nick Pope ever investigate Naval Dockyard UAP phenomena in the United Kingdom?
Well, the answer to that is we really didn't separate it out. I mean, we investigated any report that we received. inevitably over the years, and of course I was only one of a number of people doing this, we had pretty much sightings from all over the UK. And I'm sure there were some in the Devonport area, though I can't remember them, any specifics offhand. I mean, I think this question speaks to the wider issue of clustering, or the apparent clustering of sightings around military bases. And this was one of the specific issues flagged up in the ODNI report last summer. And they said there does seem to be clustering. But of course, number one, there's a potential confound that this is our own kit. I mean, obviously, if you're looking at military bases and ranges and danger areas and things, if there's something flying, it may be something that we ourselves are operating or testing. And the other problem that you have is the potential confounding factor of collection bias, that these areas are more heavily surveilled because they are military bases. There tend to be people out on patrols. There tend to be cameras monitoring the area. There tends to be all sorts of overt and covert security. And so that is one of the issues that ODNI has told DOD and the military to grip.
Thank you. I'm going to have a question on what precisely one needs in terms of telescopes to have some sort of effective coverage. That is, I think, particularly for Dr. Loeb, you have your program to look out at the sky. My understanding is, well, the sky is big, and there are many demands on each individual scope for time by astronomers. What practically do we need in terms of a series of dedicated telescopes to provide some sort of proper coverage for, even stuff in the area of the solar system?
Right. So, in fact, the telescope systems we will build on the ground will not focus on objects that come from outside the solar system into the orbit of the Earth. That will be a space mission. And we just cut the funding at about $300,000 to do a mission design of a space mission, which is good news. That's from last week. The Galileo Project will now embark on a mission design for space to come close to a space object coming into the solar system from outside that looks like Oumuamua, and take a close-up photograph. That is not the focus of the telescope systems that we are building on the ground. The telescope systems on the ground will just try to do the scientific work that will identify the nature of these unidentified aerial phenomena, the UAP, UFOs that Nick mentioned. So basically, think of it as a scientific study trying to collect high quality data that will give us information that is beyond any reasonable doubt about the nature of these objects. And for that, you just use standard optics and you decide how big of a telescope you need. Now, the existing observatories are not used for that purpose. If you think about astronomical observatories, they are focusing on objects very far away. If a bird flies near the telescope, the astronomers ignore it. They don't track it. So we are building, new telescope systems. Nobody did that before. The Galileo Project is embarking on a new scientific mission that was never pursued before. And we already designed the first telescope system that, as I mentioned, we will test at Harvard. And it will include taking a video of the sky in the infrared, in visible light, all the time, of the entire sky. So we're not looking at a small portion of the sky. We're looking at the entire sky. We have a fisheye camera in the invisible light. In the infrared, we have a collection of 8 cameras that cover the entire sky. So we're not looking for one object and tracking it. We are looking at the entire sky all the time. And then on top of that, we'll have a sensor in the radio and the audio. And all of the data that we collect, which would be a huge data stream, all of that will be analyzed by artificial intelligence software that will try to identify the nature of the objects that we see. And then there would be a tracking camera that will follow on objects of interest that do not look like a bird, not like a natural object, or a meteor, but also do not look like a drone or an airplane, a human-made object, but look unusual. And we will track these objects and collect as much data as possible. The infrared is useful at night when objects that are warm emit. You don't need the sun to shine on them, okay? So now this is one telescope system that we are testing, and then we'll make copies of it. And we calculated that you need of the order of hundreds of such systems to get a sufficiently large database that, based on the reports from the government, that will include a lot of the objects that the government was talking about, okay? So we need hundreds of such systems that will cost tens of millions of dollars. So we need funding at a level that is 10 times more than we currently have, okay, to accomplish the task of identifying the objects that the government was talking about. We'll simply get high resolution data. We'll track the objects because we cover the entire sky, so we'll see how they move. And we just need to put hundreds of such systems in different locations. That's the calculation we have done so that we will have good statistics. I should say, people were asking, why is there clustering? Well, the best correlation of clustering is with population density or with military tracking of the sky. Obviously, if you are looking up or looking at the sky, you find something unusual. And that's the best correlation you find. So if you look at UAP or UFO reports, it's very tightly correlated to first order, perfectly correlated with population density. And some people ask, why are military bases reporting more objects? Well, just because they're looking, that's all. So we don't know if there is clustering of the objects around those areas, or it's just the reflection of the fact that that's the places where people are looking. And therefore, we will put our telescope systems in many locations. And so in answer to your question, the telescope systems are of the order of 10 centimeter aperture in diameter. That would allow us 1 arcsecond resolution, which is about 5 centimeter resolution at a distance of 10 kilometers. That's a very good resolution. We'll be able to tell clearly what these objects are. And if we had more money, we could put 1 meter size telescopes that would give us even more resolution. But already with the 10 centimeter apertures, we should get much better data than a cell phone. People ask, why are all the images fuzzy? Well, it's simple. The cell phone, that's standard optics. A cell phone has an aperture of a few millimeters. I don't care if there are millions of photos from cell phones. If there are many millions of cell phones taking photos, all of them will be fuzzy because the apertures that they're using are just a few millimeters in diameter. And that's the limiting factor. That's why you will always get fuzzy images from objects at a distance of a few kilometers, because the aperture is not big enough. That's standard optics. So we are trying to get an aperture that is 100 times larger than that, so that the images will not be fuzzy. And really, it's not about getting millions of images that are low resolution. It's about getting a few images of high quality of the objects of interest.
You were reminding me, by the way, of something in naval archaeology. People used to think that all the ancient Mediterranean trade was along the coast because that all the archaeology had been done along the coast. Once they started doing it out to sea, they found out people had been going out to sea. Having said that, I want to go to a question to Ian from Kevin. I understand Ian's worries about the intent of possible alien races. Sorry, Nick, I beg your pardon, Kevin. I actually want to do Nick's. Ian's thought on the IR perspective is fascinating, and look at this phenomenon under a realist lens. What confidence do you have that a specialist subfield of this in international relations could develop or repurpose a more cooperative paradigm that is not based militarily, such as the vision of SpaceX? And then I think there's an e.g. liberalism added below.
Well, I think it's a fascinating possibility, and certainly it's a discussion that we can have. And why wouldn't we want to have this discussion? It's interesting and it's important. I mean, when I was listening to Ian's remarks, it reminded me, of course, that a lot of people, when they talk about this, you see Hollywood movies, alien invasion, and people tend to mistake and confuse and blur the lines between hostility and threat. So when we looked at this issue at the Ministry of Defense, we often used the analogy of Soviet aircraft probing at our air defenses. And we said, self-evidently, they are not, in that context, displaying any overt hostility. But no one would say that a Russian bomber does not constitute a threat. And so we have an equation for this. And I think if Ian didn't say it outright, he was certainly speaking to it. And the equation is that threat is capability times intent. And when you look at the UAP issue, you have some fairly interesting data for capability, suggesting that it's quite impressive. But we really have no meaningful data on intent. And that's why we say we can't really define or conclude whether there is or isn't a threat. And in those circumstances, government, the military, the intelligence community would rather assume there's a threat and be relieved if it doesn't materialize than assume there's no threat and then get caught out if it does. But it all goes back to the question of where you embed your UFO program. And this, I think, gets to the heart of Ian's IR point and the danger of mirroring and the danger that we create our own future with this. I mean, look at what I mentioned about where in Congress is this currently sitting. It's sitting with the intelligence committees and with the Armed Services Committee. Where do UFO programs sit in most governments that look at this issue? In the DoD, in the Air Force. Very few nations, France is the exception. They embed their UFO program in their French National Space Center. And so that is absolutely, to answer the question, a conversation we must have to get away from looking at this through a very narrow focus.
Thank you. And Ian, did you want to respond to it directly about the IR aspects?
Yeah, I mean, I think in practice, where that would start and fit would be either in the private sector like SpaceX, where they actually do talk about the IR, capability or the IR implications of what this exploration is doing and what we may or may not encounter, because that's a way to talk to multiple countries at once, as opposed to, pigeonholing it in one intelligence agency in one country and then redacting everything and, closing it off and then creating more zeitgeist. One of the ways to do this and get around it would be to either embed it in programs in universities that are multidisciplinary, or in the private sector, through something like SpaceX, where you do bring in the IR implications of this. Because if something is discovered, countries are going to react in their own way, societies are going to react in their own way. And this is a way to sort of not only guide the policy implications of what's discovered and how that's disseminated and handled, but also in a way to sort of avoid these intelligence problems, at least on the human end, where we're projecting out into space prematurely and, and weaponizing it before we start talking, if there is something out there, or if we decide to just keep weaponizing it and wind up in a war with each other in space. Having, an IR implication along those lines embedded in these programs is an absolute necessity. Realism was just a place to start, because if you look at it, fortunately, historically, this began under, preparation for war. Werner Von Braun was actually arrested in 1944 for diverting funds and technology for what the Gestapo called space exploration rather than the war effort. So if you look at the auspices of how this stuff historically developed, it's not comforting, at least from the one example that we know of a species reaching into space, and that's us. So yeah, in order to sort of add an alternative, you do have to develop this IR sort of perspective in these think tanks and in these programs, or things like SpaceX, in order to talk to multiple audiences at once.
I have a question for Dr. Loeb before he goes. Looking in the archive, sometimes we discover new species in the basements of natural history museums. Should we have a concerted plan to look in all the astronomical archives, all the images again, with the idea of looking for, unidentified phenomena, evidence for that?
Well, it might be interesting, but it's much better to collect new data because we have now much better instrumentation. I should say that the travel between stars is so long, it takes, depending on how far the spacecraft comes from, but it takes light tenths of thousands of years to traverse the Milky Way galaxy. So it's a long journey, even if you move at the speed of light, but most likely, chemical rockets take 10,000 times longer than light to traverse that distance. So just multiply tens of thousands of years by 10,000, that's, hundreds of millions of years. And that's a long journey, and creatures would not really have the patience to be on such, unlike what you see on Star Trek. So, and so the most likely encounter would be with equipment that could be either trash, like Voyager would be in a billion years, it will be just space trash, or it could be functional. It could be equipped with artificial intelligence and sort of autonomous. It doesn't wait for any guidance. It learns from experience and adapts to the environment. So it could be something of that type, but most likely AI astronaut, not anything living on it. And we might need our own AI systems to figure out their AI systems. And, it's a learning experience for us. It all depends on the technological gap between them and us. And frankly, we don't have a protocol how to deal with it. Astronomers thought about detecting radio signals. There is no urgency there because the stars are, tens of thousands of light years away. So you have time to think about it if you get a radio signal. But imagine a visitor in your backyard. We don't have an organization that represents humanity. And frankly, even if we had such an organization, it's not clear exactly how it will function. And moreover, there will always be people outside the organization that will do whatever they want. And they could risk the rest of us. And, I asked a couple of weeks ago, I met with Henry Kissinger. I asked him, based on your experience with China and Russia, how would you respond to a messenger from a culture that you don't know? And, given his experience with realpolitik, and his answer was to try and figure out the intent, what is this equipment trying to accomplish first before deciding anything. I think that would be a smart move. And I also think that if they wanted to harm us, they could have done it long ago. So I wouldn't worry too much. I mean, the way I think of this is, if you walk down the street, you don't care about the ants on the pavement because they're so inferior relative to you. And irrespective of what the protocol or strategy the ants take, they might be stepped on, irrespective of what they do. So my point is, it may not matter what we do, actually.
All right, thank you. Look, I'm going to say, since I think you have to jump off, I'm going to say thank you very much. It's been wonderful having you. I'm deeply grateful. So very happy.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
And I'll just say to the others, well, Nick, are you willing to stay on a little bit longer for questions and so on?
Absolutely, yes.
In that case, well, I will then go to a question I think might be more naturally to you from Tom Wallace. Sightings appear to be cyclic in nature. Are there any known causalities that influence this?
It's a very interesting and complex question. The short answer is yes, there do appear to be cycles of interest. The long answer is we don't really know why that is. When you look at this subject, of course, the first thing you apply is the iceberg principle, that your UFO sightings that are reported are a tiny proportion. Most of the sightings go unreported, either because people don't know who to contact or because they don't come forward at all because of ridicule or disbelief. And those people that do come forward, of course, there's no single global focal point. So you only have a fragmented idea of what is happening. Some people report to the media, some people report to government agencies where there are programs, others report to civilian UFO research groups that may exist. So we don't really know. Also, the media plays a huge influence in this, and people tend to follow the herd when it comes to this. So when a big UFO story breaks, like talked about with the New York Times, TV producers realize that there's a lot of interest in this. They make more programs. That smokes out reports because it creates a receptive environment for people who've had sightings to come forward. And very often in the media, particularly in local newspapers, an article will end with a question. Did you see the UFO? Have you had a sighting? Come forward and contact our news desk. And so that, as I say, smokes these reports out that otherwise might have gone unreported. So many, many different factors at play.
Can I chime in on that? Because that's actually something I came across as well.
Sure.
So when I was looking at the paper, I didn't really go into the sightings and the waves of sightings, but I noticed that once you have a critical mass of people conducting air travel or military presence in the air, like in the 40s and 50s, you do see a spike of sightings, and that's partly collection bias because you have more of a presence in the air anyway. So you, between people in the air and also people on the ground looking at more objects of human origin in the air, you're going to have more sightings that people don't understand. And then you had a peak of sightings in the 1990s. And what's interesting now is that the sightings actually skyrocketed a little bit over COVID because more people had less to do and they were looking up at the sky with their phones. So it's largely just human beings psyching themselves out. It's a cognitive thing. You know, if you ever go to a bar or a pub and you see someone searching for keys frantically around the light post, it's because that's where the light is. It doesn't actually mean that's where the keys are. So when you have more light posts, you're going to see more people looking for their keys there. So it is the clustering, and it just correlates with what people are doing in the sky and with drones. And 99% of the time it's just human beings looking at their own machinations in the air.
I have a question, which I'm hoping is not silly, but one of the standard things to say about, you say you saw a UFO, how do you know that isn't just, in fact, the latest version of the Lockheed aircraft being done in a super secret, American defense, test or something? It strikes me, however, to make that case, you also have to approach a different unknown, which is, what is the amount of defense technology which is not known to the public at large? Is there a way to approach that systematically to parallel the considerations of the unknowns of UFOs, and therefore to slot in what is the probability that the sighting is of something, in effect, secret by us?
Well, I think that depending on which defense or aviation journalist you ask, or expert, if it's someone within government, I think you could say that aerospace technology runs, and I've heard different figures for this, and it's not uniform, but 10, 15, 20 years ahead of what is public knowledge. I mean, I think it would stagger people, for example, to know just when the first, certainly theoretical experiments into stealth in terms of radar were being conducted. I mean, literally going back decades. So decades before the F-117 was unveiled, I mean. So that's one factor. And of course, you're only ever going to get, unless you've got sort of whistleblower testimony, and that may not be totally reliable, you're only ever going to get a sort of unclassified assessment of what that figure may be. So suffice to say, technology runs years ahead of what will be public knowledge. I would say, though, that the chances of people misidentifying these things as UAP are perhaps slightly less than most people might suppose, because these sorts of things are almost always tested in very remote, off-limits areas. I mean, of course, we can't get through this session without saying the phrase Area 51. So I've said it. In the UK, in my own experience, for example, these sorts of things would be tested at night, offshore, in some of the very large remote ranges and danger areas that we had. So it's not necessarily something you'll see flying over suburbia. So that's why I say it runs many years ahead, but you won't often stumble across it.
Thank you. That makes sense to me. Ian, did you have anything to add on that subject?
No, I mean, I think that's true. And the one problem that human beings is that, you know, we see a phenomenon and then we project meaning onto it. And as we have more things like drones, etc., flying around and more cell phones to view them, more people are going to project onto that. And from a scientific standpoint, that creates more noise. So it's a cognitive problem ultimately.
I have a specific question from Donald Morgan. Do Russia or China report UAP phenomena?
Well, they certainly have government programs looking at it, but because of the nature of those societies, what we actually know about those programs and the sightings and what we even know about policy is not a complete picture in intelligence terms.
I came across some of that when I was doing the paper. China, they certainly perceive not only an extraterrestrial presence out there somewhere and they're afraid of it, but that is factoring into their thinking in terms of space. I don't know about sightings. I haven't come across that publicly. In the early 1990s, there was some stuff published by, after the wall fell, with retired Soviet pilots talking about seeing some things. But, again, because you're talking about closed societies, if France is at one end of the spectrum with being very public about it because their program is embedded in their scientific community as opposed to their military apparatus, Russia and China are at the other end of where everything is very closed off in general, not just related to this, but things, social media is censored, information is very controlled, and on this issue the US is somewhere in the middle.
Thank you. There's a questions also about determining the threat level. We talked about criteria we set for determining if the phenomena is a threat. Yeah, that's Don Grantham. And I guess this was being talked about capability and intention. I mean, could we and should we develop a protocol for saying what sorts of actions we might perceive would count as threatening or not? And is there actually any basis in our previous, how do you deal with what the Soviets are doing with their aircraft that could be applied to this?
Well, I think there absolutely should be a protocol. We don't have much of a blueprint for it. I think the nearest we really have is the SETI community, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, the radio astronomers, who drew up a document, I think it's called the Declaration of Principles. And of course, it's very narrowly focused, but it's perhaps the best start point we have for something like this. And it says, what if you pick up a signal from another civilization, like you see in the movie Contact, which was based on the eponymous book by Carl Sagan. So there was some pretty good scientific thinking behind it. And the SETI Declaration of Principles basically says, first, you validate your data by cross-checking with another radio telescope, and then you publish, and you publish the data. But as Avi Loeb was saying earlier in this event, That's not necessarily the scenario that we would be dealing with. It's one thing to pick up a radio signal from a distant civilization you may never meet, but it's quite another if something actually turns up in your solar system. And in a universe nearly 14 billion years old, there might be civilizations out there with millions of years head start on us. And even without going down the sort of science fiction road of warp drive and wormholes, even at sublight speed, AI probes that have been launched hundreds of millions of years ago can easily traverse the interstellar distances. So there's no scientific reason why these things couldn't turn up. And yeah, absolutely. Why wouldn't we want to have a protocol? It would be interesting to draw one up, and it would be prudent to have one.
Can I chime in on that?
Yes, of course.
I mean, so the one thing too that if you see this from an intelligence challenge, if there is something out there trying to talk to us, there's no real necessarily way to communicate, in the sense that we wouldn't have a reference point for communicating meaning. You know, we could send a teddy bear up into space thinking it's like the most lovable thing ever, and if it was picked up, there's no way to know how they would interpret it. So from an intelligence standpoint with intent, right, at least in the earthly context, you can study histories, you can study a language, you can kind of get the sense of how a Russia or a China or how Saudi Arabia views and interprets the world around it, and discern intent that way. You have no way of doing that with this. So the only real way to do that would be to create a protocol with an observable action that you could see. And that creates its own challenges, right? So you send tests up there, and how does, whether it's an object or if it's a message source, how does it react in a way? Is it observable? How does it respond to it? Because they could be sending messages to us, even if we picked it up, we had no way of knowing if they're hostile or friendly, etc. One of the first things that we as human beings sent out into space was a broadcast of Hitler. And to us, that is terrifying, but to them, it's just, oh, well, what is that? If it is something out there, it's just a little guy with a weird mustache. There's no way of knowing how they would interpret that. So that's ultimately the challenge we'd have to overcome. So if there is a protocol, it would have to be some sort of testable observation that we could see how it was reacted to.
Yeah, may I come back on
Sure.
on that?
Yes,
I mean, I think again, I mentioned the sci-fi movie Contact. I should also mention Arrival, which goes into issues of how would we communicate, and there are some scientists who have done some work on this. I mean, some of the SETI post-detection work. I think John Elliott at Leeds University has done some work, but we saw in the movie Arrival, for example, could you try to communicate? What problems would you have in communicating the subtle differences between a weapon and a tool? And Ian's example about sending the teddy bear into space. What if the teddy bear was an image of some terrible super predator species that had only just been conquered by the rest of the more peaceful universe and was seen as a threat? We see it in our own gestures. I mean, look, if we have difficulty with what's a gesture of friendship and a gesture that's a rude gesture in human culture, how could we bridge those gaps across a civilization where we had no reference point? I was once peripherally involved in some diplomatic talks between the UK government and the Hong Kong government, and there had been no progress all morning. And then the UK delegation leader just said as a friendly comment, let's go to lunch. Let's see if we make better progress in the afternoon. He said, let's not talk business over lunch. This was taken as a huge insult by the Hong Kong Chinese, because to them, it smacked of telling them what they may or may not discuss. And yet the remark, let's not talk business over dinner or over lunch, was meant in friendship. So these are important and difficult problems that we should grapple with.
It strikes me there's an interesting philosophical background. In effect, is every human being alike? See Thomas Hobbes. Do we all vary? According to culture, see Michel de Montaigne, except it's a problem on steroids if you're dealing with the alien world. I have a question about law, actually, and this is going to build on international relations. To what extent are we building a legal framework to deal with stuff in orbit and beyond? And to what extent should our attempts to build law take into account the possibility of, somebody else out there?
Well, from just knowing how law develops, you have to establish some sort of control first if you're going to establish law. But even without that, if you're going to be putting out law, you can't create laws for things that don't exist. So if you look at some treaties with Russia, for example, they all agree, okay, no nuclear weapons on the moon. Well, that's not quite feasible yet. So why not outlaw it? Sure. But you can look at one thing I'll tell you about IR and even national or comparative politics. When someone's in power, an entity's in power, does not mean they're necessarily going to follow law, whether they're a public actor or a private actor. And because of the high stakes, low probability aspect of this, you have to get this right the first time, quite possibly. So from that standpoint, one of the historical examples or parallels to this that's brought up a lot is the contact between the Spanish and the Aztecs. If you think about it, the Spanish, if you're picking a random Spaniard from, Cortez's troops, when they see Tenochtitlan, they're going to see images that were reminiscent of every Renaissance depiction of hell ever in Europe. And if you're an Aztec, you're going to see, you don't know what a horse is, you don't know what a gun is. You're going to see a stick that breathes fire, an animal that doesn't look like anything you've seen before. They're wearing armor. For all you know, that could be skin that reflects sunlight. You've never seen facial hair before. Just beyond the motives of Cortez himself, if you read Letters from Mexico, just the average person on both sides of that's an absolutely terrifying encounter from both ends. So it's a recipe for disaster. And that's within our own species. So if you put this out there, then you kind of have to be very careful and get it right the first time, because it could be the intelligence failure to end all intelligence failures and humanity along with it if it's done incorrectly. So there does need to be, as things are probing out there with telescopes and projects like this, there does have to be that kept very clearly in mind. And I'm not sure that is being kept in mind.
And Nick, do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, I think it was a great point. I think it does remind me of something that came up earlier in the talk, though, and it was this question of taking this almost out of the hands of government. And we see now almost inexorably the space program transitioning, not completely out of the hands of nation states. I mean, obviously things like Space Force have a bearing here, but we certainly see the rise of influence of the people like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson and Yuri Milner, and the fact that it's going to be the private sector certainly will have, I don't know whether it will turn out to be an equal or bigger voice, but they are and will be players increasingly. So this isn't just a conversation about nation states and or the international community. It's also about the people who are actually going to be, more often than not, the ones in the front line, if I can use that term. I mean, if anyone has first contact with a species that is exploring the cosmos and reaches our solar system, that first contact might be with Elon Musk. So we've got to factor that into our discussion and make these people part of the conversation.
I have a question, which is, it's actually building somewhat on some of these questions, but a great deal of this turns out on, are the governments keeping information secret from the people at large about evidence they found? And and it turns out they had not mentioned they had various programs looking for stuff. I'm going to ask, should governments not be sharing everything with people? Is there, in point of fact, a case to be made that this shouldn't just be open information, free for all, that they're right to want to restrict some information? And I guess if there is such an argument, what do you think is the strongest argument for it? And if you don't think there was one, just give me the argument against it.
Well, the laws, the rules and laws on classifying information exist and can be extrapolated onto the UAP topic, just as they can be extrapolated onto anything. Properly applied, the rules, and I don't have the exact definitions in front of me, and they vary, of course, between nations. But for example, the definition of top secret information is generally along the lines of information, the compromise of which would cause catastrophic damage to the national interest or national security of the United States, for example. So if those definitions are being properly applied to UAP information, then fair enough. The suspicion is that they're not. The suspicion is that sometimes classifying information is used to classify something which is, for example, politically embarrassing or something. But let's just suppose you were talking about an extraterrestrial presence or strong evidence thereof and a technology. Most technology, for example, that you would envisage being necessary for interstellar travel would involve very large amounts of energy. And pretty much anything that involves large amounts of energy can be weaponized. And so then you have, the American people have a right to know. But once you put the information out there, of course, everyone can see it. Russia, China, North Korea, Iran, ISIS, whoever. So these are the questions that arise.
Just to add to that, if you have that sort of, even if it's just something as simple as a radio signal from someplace so far away, there's no chance of direct contact. If that was made public knowledge, what are the ramifications of that? If you look at the Arab Spring, for example, one protester who immolated himself because his food cart was taken away, that totally changed the dynamics of the Middle East and caused one of the largest, migration crises of the last 2 centuries for Europe. So if, something as small as that on a planetary scale, once that information was out, you have no control over how Russia or China would respond to it. Maybe one of them weaponizes, right? Or both of them. Maybe the European Union wants to do something else in terms of diplomacy. There's no sense that we always have this assumption that human beings would act as a unified actor in making contact. There's no case with that. There's no reason to necessarily think that. There's nothing to rule out that one power would try to reach out to this entity to ally with it. Certainly, if you go back to the conquistador example with Mexico, we know that there were plenty of indigenous allies for Cortez when he attacked Tenochtitlan. The indigenous populations were not unified. So to project that, all of humanity would be on the same page once that becomes public knowledge, that's not necessarily the case. So that would have to be very carefully disseminated, very, very carefully, because humanity could decide to go its own way. Different states could do their own thing. You could have different societies react in different ways. You could have spikes in suicide rates just from mass panic. So yeah, the ramifications of something even as that small could be quite catastrophic.
And the nation, if we go back to international relations and competitiveness between nations, the nation that first acquires extraterrestrial technology, if it was only that nation, is arguably going to be in a very dominant position if they can figure it out. So there is an incentive for keeping this highly classified, deeply compartmentalized, and hope that you'll be the first to get it. I'm not condoning it, but I'm saying that is the way things tend to unfold.
Phrase prisoner's dilemma is somehow ringing in my ears at this point. Yes, I think that applies. I am going to say we're getting up towards 3:30. We technically said 3. Most of our NAS webinars, end at about 3:30. I think what I would like to do is, may I ask each of you to perhaps have a closing statement, a minute or a bit more if you want, closing statement, and then I'll just sort of wrap things up for the webinar. I guess, Ian, may I ask you to go first?
Sure. So kind of jumping off from the findings that I came across with how we know that there's one species in space and it's doing it in a militarily competitive way, and the risks of that. I think from an IR standpoint, we need to go back to sort of more primitive, older versions of IR theory in general, where we bring in questions of human nature, because that's ultimately the questions that we're going to be dealing with if we do come across something like this. And that's something that's fallen out of favor for quite some time in IR thinking. And that's something that needs to be brought back, and certainly something that needs to be brought to inform policy decisions. We need to understand ourselves better as a species before we do any of these things, because we may not have time to do that after the fact. So I would say if there's one takeaway from this, it would be to know thyself.
Thank you. Nick?
I would say to anyone who is interested in this and wants to know what's actually going on behind all the hype that they hear, watch out for these UFO UAP provisions in the defense bill and the regular reports that Congress is now mandating that ODNI and the DoD send as we move forward and try to figure out what is in our airspace. Is it us? Is it Russia or China? Or is it something else? And if it is something else, getting a little bit more philosophical about it and the possibility of extraterrestrials, even if you regard it as low probability, it is high impact. And one of my favorite sayings on all this with UAP is that the skeptics have to be right every day. The believers only need to be right once. And in concluding on the philosophy of this almost, I mean, questions like, are we alone or not in the universe? And are we being visited? Are some of the most interesting, biggest, and profound questions we can ask ourselves. And yet, I say, are we not edging ever closer to a potential answer to this? And if so, if you'll excuse the pun, watch this space.
Thank you so much. All right, that's a terrible pun. Thank you both very much. And my thanks also, of course, to Dr. Loeb, who alas had another commitment he had to go to at 3. So thank you very much. Thank you to the audience. We can't do this without you. Your questions make this possible, and it's for you. I want to say again, if you have questions for any of the panelists, please send them to me. That's randall@nas.org, RANDALL@nas.org. I'll be glad to forward them to the panelists so they can have the option to answer you. Now, in addition to that, this will be on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. Sometimes it seems like 24 seconds, but I better make sure and just say it's 24 hours just to be sure. Now, I also want to give an advertisement for we are doing other webinars coming up. We have American literature, great American literature. The next one is Call of the Wild on April 5th. Our American history series, the next one is April 12th on the fall of communism. And this may indeed be the first of a series on, I don't quite know what we need to come up with a good title for it, but in effect, academic looks at subjects which have been, I think, a somewhat speculative edge to them, but which may not be speculative anymore. And so this combination of astronomy, security knowledge, and international relations on the subject of unidentified flying objects is the effect. It's sort of a prototype for what we might do with different subjects. So thank you all again. It's been wonderful.